The goal of this demo is improving the layout of our site. We already have made the skeleton using the new HTML5 tags in the demos of module 1. In this demo, I'm going to make sure that each element gets its correct position on the page. And for that, I'm going to use some CSS. So what you see here is the current state of the index page, and we're going to improve that. As you can see in the head block of this page, there's currently no reference to a CSS style sheet yet. We've seen in the slides that there are several ways to include CSS in our pages. However, the best one is using a separate style sheet and referencing that using a link tag in the head. I must confess I have cheated again in this demo a little bit. I'm not going to do it anymore, I promise. I'm not going to be typing all the CSS. It would take us again too long. I have prepared the CSS and I'm going to take you through the creation of the layout of the page. So the first thing I'm going to do is drag that CSS file in Visual Studio into the HTML. And automatically Visual Studio is going to include this link tag referencing the layout.css, so the style sheet. Let's take a look at that CSS. Here we are in the CSS, and the first CSS rule that you see here is one which is applied on the body. If you think back of what we saw in the slides, notice that there's no prefix before the body declaration here. I don't have a hash sign or a dot. It is simply body. That is because body is indeed an HTML element, and therefore to select it, I don't have to use any prefix. Inside the CSS rule, I have a couple of style declarations, which are saying that, for example, the width of the body should be 1000 pixels. I'm also setting the margin left and the margin right. I'm not using any shorthand for this one, and I'm also specifying the font family. Next, I have a comparable rule for the header. Again, I'm using the HTML element directly as the selector. Now I want to build up the content of my header. Remember that in the header we had the image, then I had a span containing the text Joe's Coffee Store, and that search input type that was on the far right. The first thing I need to do is I need to get hold of this header logo. And to do that, I'm using the selector that is prefixed with a dot. So I'm using a prefix here to select a class. Notice then I'm using a float, and I specify the value of this float to be left. What this will do is making sure that the entire header logo block is going to be shifted to the left. Now inside this class, I had a direct child of type image. And I'm also using the direct child selector here to select that image and apply a style onto it. And I'm giving that image a width and a height. The next thing I want to do is make sure that that search input type goes to the far right. And notice it also has a class applied on it named search box. In the CSS, I'm again using a class selector, so it's prefixed with that dot again. And then I specify that it should float to the right. The span containing the text Joe's Coffee Store needs to go to the left of the image we already have placed there. We'll change on this span later on, but notice for now it has an ID defined named header name. Now in my CSS, I can now use a selector based on the ID, so I prefix the ID with the hash sign. In here, I specify some properties for the text. And as mentioned, we'll come back to that one later on. Now with the header in place, let's now continue with those two images we need to place on our page. I have these images placed here in two separate divs, since they don't contain any real content. It's just for layout purposes, so that is why I'm using a div here. One has an ID welcome image, the one on the right has the ID coffee of the month. Well, these are pretty easy to add to our page. The welcome image gets a float to the left, and the coffee of the month image gets a float, which places it at the right of the body. The next block that we need to lay out was that welcome text. For now, we'll make it in just one column. We'll add multi-column later. This was placed in a section with an ID welcome text, which also again had a particular header. In my CSS, I'm again using a selector based on ID, and I make sure that this section floats to the left. I'm also giving it a width of 70%. I then need some separate properties on the header, which was a child, a direct child even, of that welcome text section. So I'm again using the child selector. The aside with the ID of events is pretty similar to layout. I have the hash event selector to select the entire site and give it a float to the right. I use again a child selector to apply a different layout on the header. And then inside of that aside, there was also a UL, so an unordered list with a couple of list items. And I'm again using a child selector to apply different properties on these. The section with the bestsellers is pretty easy to understand. I'm not going to spend time on it. The last thing I'm going to add to my layout is the footer. Notice that I don't have any ID or class applied on the footer, so we'll have to use the tag name again. Indeed, here in the CSS, I'm again using the tag selector and I'm using a clear both property on it. This will make sure that the footer will take up all the available space and doesn't allow any other elements on its left or its right. Let's now run the page. Notice that the site's layout has dramatically improved. We're already much closer to where we need to get. Here you see the bestsellers and the footer at the bottom. All of this was done by just applying some simple CSS with some selectors that we've seen in the slides. I'm not going to take you through all the different pages. They are all pretty similar. I suggest you take a look at the code in the download. Let's go back to the slides for now.